Hi everybody, this is Liam Martin from Running Remote, and in today's video, we have a little bit of an interesting one. Number one, I have someone with me. It's not just me looking at a camera all day long, and we are going to be talking about 5 things you should really know before hiring a remote employee from a lawyer. But why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Liam. So I'm really happy to be here, especially because I can't be at the Running Remote conference in Bali. It's a little bit ways away from me. I'm a lawyer working in Toronto. I'm a civil litigator specializing in employment law. My name is Tara Vasdani, and I run my own firm called Remote Law Canada. So it's perfect for this venture right here.
So what do you need to know before you're going to hire a remote employee, or your 100th remote employee in our case?
Good question. So I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is definitely health and safety. Mm-hmm. It's a huge insurance liability when you've got an employee working from home and you haven't adequately set out your agreement and your arrangement in that, ensuring that the workspace complies with health and safety local laws, ensuring that there are no trip hazards around, and especially, and this is the one that most people don't think about, ensuring that you've properly defined the hours of work. So if there is some sort of slip and fall or something happens in the workspace that qualifies for workers' comp or some sort of health and safety insurance, if you haven't properly defined the hours of work, it becomes really difficult to define whether it happened in the context of their employment or not. So health and safety is definitely the first one that comes to mind for me.
And when we're talking about this, we're talking about hiring an employee, not necessarily a contractor, because there's a lot of remote companies that will hire contractors simply because logistically it's actually a lot easier to be able to hire contractors in comparison to employees. And so I'd love to be able to hear your thoughts on that, what you think the advantages and disadvantages are for both.
Absolutely. So I think generally with remote companies, the first thought is always to possibly consider an independent contractor arrangement. And that's mainly because, like you said, what it does is it shifts a lot of the liabilities that we absorb in hiring remote employees to the specific individual. So for example, going back to health and safety, the independent contractor is responsible for their own insurance.
Got it.
And when employees need to consider, or employers need to consider whether they want to hire independent contractors or employees, they also have to consider the fact that the independent contractor does not have an employment agreement, so can walk off the job whenever they feel like it. You don't have proper employee engagement because there isn't a strong commitment to the company. You're not working in a situation where there are benefits that you're offering, typical employee benefits to this employee or this individual, which makes them possibly not want to stay. And essentially, they're looking out for themselves. It's not an arrangement where they're thinking all the time as to what's best for the company. They're more so thinking what's best for their arrangement. Now, that being said, it is an attractive model because, again, it offloads insurance obligations. It offloads a lot of needing to supply tools to the employee. A lot of the checks and balances that you need to ensure are in place, redrafting your employment agreements, having a proper remote work policy in place, consistently checking up on your employee. A lot of these things are eliminated when they become an independent contractor because you're essentially not responsible for them.
Got it. Yeah. So now that we've got that clear, and you would probably know whether you're going to hire employees or contractors. And to be honest with you, the reality is I would probably say the majority of small remote companies probably go the contractor route as opposed to the employee route. But let's assume that you're going to go the employee route regardless. What are some other points that you need to take into consideration before hiring somebody?
Sure. So going back to the hours of work, I would really ensure that your employment agreement squares off everything that could arise during this arrangement. So ensuring that your hours of work are defined, ensuring that you've spoken with the employee about certain childcare obligations, for example, that they've got, so times when they will be away from the remote workspace, ensuring that the employment agreement covers off any expectations you have that they're going to show up at the office, whether it's once a week, whether it's once a month, ensuring that they have a proper reporting structure to you as a remote employee, whether it's going to be through a Google Doc or some sort of virtual platform where you can communicate if they're meeting their targets, if they're achieving the projects that you've set out for them. So really it's about having a very specific and detailed employment agreement. And then with that flows the fact that they should probably have independent legal advice in the same way that the employer should run their employment agreement by a lawyer.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, when we're talking about, we've hired this employee, what are some of the, in your experience, what are some of the problems that you've seen from people that are either remote first companies or what we call on-premise companies that end up making their first remote hire? What are the biggest mistakes that you see inside of this space?
Sure. So I could give you a good example. We had a Canadian case where an employee was working in British Columbia, and it was an on-premise company that later allowed this employee to work remotely. The employee began working remotely, and later on his wife found a job in Alberta, so another province, and had to move out over there. The employee didn't advise their employer and instead moved over there because they had now signed this edited agreement that arranged for a remote arrangement.
Yeah.
And so the employee went over there, and essentially the employer ended up calling them back into work. The employee refused to come back into work as a full-time employee on premise, and the employee brought a discrimination claim stating that, you know, they had already arranged for this work arrangement. They didn't define where he would be working remotely. All they said was that he would be allowed to work remotely.
Right.
The employee won the case.
Right.
The employer had an obligation to put into their employment agreement that if they chose to call the employee back to work, the employee would have to arrive, and they had to define where they would be able to work and where they wouldn't be able to work.
So, I mean, defining where the worker can work, defining the definition of remote, all these types of things, you probably got to put that together.
Absolutely.
In terms of just when you're making that initial either employment agreement or even a contractor agreement, you would need to be able to define those terms before you start that engagement.
For sure.
Got it. And so for people that are watching this video, I'm pretty sure we can actually provide some of that templated information.
Yes.
Can we not?
Yes. So I've got employment agreements, I've got template remote work policies, template health and safety checklists, onboarding checklists. We've done everything. And what we've done is essentially we've created these templates that you can download. So I've got Canadian versions. My colleague Emma Houston in Australia has got Australian versions. If you go to www.theremoteexpert.com, all of these forms are downloadable.
Okay.
So you can head on over there. They're template documents, and that what we offer are specialized services. So as practicing lawyers, you can come to us as a company, and we can customize this agreement for you on our hourly rate.
One of the things that I would reinforce is don't cheap out on this kind of stuff at the beginning, because it always ends up costing you more. I have this saying that I've never paid a lawyer a penny in my entire life. They've only made me money, which is true. So at the end of the day,
It's good to hear.
spend that money on those proper structures, because in the future, you'll have these interesting situations that you never would have thought about. And even though as entrepreneurial people and business owners, sometimes lawyers kind of bug me because they always talk about all of the things that could go wrong versus all of the things that could go right.
Absolutely.
They're generally not my most favorite conversations that I like to have, but they're the people that will be able to bring you through that stress test to know, okay, this is how you're going to structure the way that you build these remote work agreements, as an example, to make sure that you don't get screwed, which is something that is so important, particularly as we continue on with these remote
Yes.
work agreements. And just kind of the future of remote work is quite bright, but now we're going to have these new challenges. In essence, we have an entirely new category of worker that exists inside of the employment ecosystem that we're going to have to basically figure out.
And the benefit actually to companies right now in the fact that it's in its infancy, and I talk about this a lot because I talk a lot on artificial intelligence developments in the law. Because this worker is still in its infancy, we have the opportunity to define it at an early stage. There is not case law, there's not much of it that's already against these remote companies. So if we are now adopting these agreements and creating them as we go along, we can start to build the law around the remote worker as opposed to the opposite way. So we're very fortunate. And, you know, it's not always the greatest conversation, but I think it's worthwhile talking to a lawyer.
So outside of smashing the like button, what other things should people do that are looking to do their first hire, like what's the next action point inside of this document, or sorry, inside of this video, where they can go in and look at some of your templated work? Like what would a generalized workflow look for you for hiring a remote employee?
Perfect. So the first thing I would say, and a document that I actually didn't mention, is a remote work request form.
Okay.
So what I would do if I was a remote company or a company on premise or looking to go fully remote, I would supply any potential employees with this request form. And what the request form has, and it's also available on our website, is it asks the employee to define how they will communicate with the employer and how they will meet their targets and how they will ensure that all of their productivity expectations are being met.
Got it.
They have them define their hours of work, have them define their reporting structure. So it's all well and good to ask the remote company to do it, but for me, from a workflow perspective, I would put it in the hands
Reverse
of the
it.
employee.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, that's an interesting way to look at it. I never thought about it that way. Okay, so create that document, and then when they filled out that document, then you basically go to your templated remote work agreement. You fill in all of the holes of when their work hours are recorded and all that kind of stuff. And then basically you get them to sign it in whichever jurisdiction that they're currently located in, correct?
Absolutely.
Do you sign out of the corporation, like out of your country, or do you sign out of theirs?
So in order to avoid a conflict of laws issue, which is really important, I think it's important to put into your agreement which jurisdiction will govern the agreement.
Right.
So whether the employee is in Nigeria and you are in in the US, I would suggest that the company actually take action in that area and clearly define which jurisdiction will govern the employment relationship. And then the employee, depending on wherever they are, they're still bound by the laws of that jurisdiction because they reviewed the agreement, you've told them they should get independent legal advice, and if ever there's an issue, I would think that jurisdiction should apply.
Cool. Yeah. So thanks for coming on and telling us about this fantastic information. For anyone that is interested, where are they going to find you?
So you can find me specifically at www.remotelawcanada.com. You'll find all of my info. You can reach me in any way.
Got it. And also for people that are just interested in asking a question directly, just ask it down in the comments below, and I'll try to rope her in to answer some of those questions if anyone has them. So you can write them down below, and we'll link to everything down below as well. So I hope that you enjoyed that video, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.